I want to discuss a particular aspect of this whole situation, and that is surplus order. Surplus order is a euphemistic term for tyranny, essentially, and it refers to when order is oversupplied, where it isn't needed or isn't helpful. Since Sunday, police have finally started pushing back against rioters and looters. Not enough to really get the situation under control, but some. They've also been supplying some surplus order, however. They arrested and charged a shopkeeper in Minnesota for shooting a looter. As I understand it, though I'm no expert, Minnesota law does not allow you to use violence to defend property and requires you to retreat unless you're in your home. Another store owner in Van Nuys was trying to defend his store from looters with some friends when the cops showed up and arrested them. They arrested a truck driver who drove into a crowd of protesters in Minnesota. Media headlines falsely claimed that he drove through the protesters, but he didn't drive through the protesters because he stopped in their midst. And if he wanted to drive through them, presumably he would have driven through them. But for his generosity in not flattening them like bugs, he was beaten, robbed, and arrested. Although thankfully he was released on Tuesday without charges. Police have imposed curfews in many cities, which in and of itself isn't too unreasonable given the circumstances. But if they just went after the rioters and looters, maybe they wouldn't have to. If they just banned protests or allowed them only within designated areas, maybe they wouldn't have to inconvenience everyone. Like I said, it's not too unreasonable for a short time, but it's definitely a broad brush kind of solution when maybe a more focused one would be more effective and less costly. And there's video of cops and National Guard walking through an apparently peaceful neighborhood, shouting aggressively and shooting paintballs at peaceful, law-abiding citizens to get them to go back into their homes. Meanwhile, DC is dropping all charges against arrested rioters and looters. Leaders like Minneapolis' Democrat mayor or North Carolina's Democrat governor give lip service to the false and malicious fake news narratives that incited these riots and are being used to justify this looting and legitimize the grievance and entitlement of the rioters and looters, even as they may weakly condemn their actions. Cops in several cities have even taken a knee in solidarity with Black Lives Matters, affirming their false narratives and legitimizing their grievances and aims. The latest thing now is National Guard taking knees to grovel and beg for approval and civilized behavior from violent and unruly protesters, rioters, and looters, confirming that our government is filled with cucks and appeasers on every level. The message is clear. Cops will not protect you. They'll protect rioters and looters. They'll protect Antifa. They'll endure the stones and the firebombs and the vehicular assaults, and they won't fight back hard enough to put a stop to it or protect people and property. They won't suppress a lawless mob justly, but they will meaningfully prevent you from defending yourself and your property in many cases, because they know that you, as a law-abiding citizen, probably won't resist even if they're treating you unjustly. And why should we expect any different? That's what's easiest, at least for now. That's what's easiest unless and until they finally get tired of the daily looting and riots and decide to truly confront it. That's what's easiest, at least until we've had enough and start resisting them too to put a stop to it ourselves. And moreover, a lot of cops are actually educated that the big threat is right-wing extremism by anti-white Jewish supremacist hate groups like the ADL and SPLC, which, while I don't know that they're the parent organizations of Antifa exactly, are very much fellow travelers to Antifa, are very much in the same vein as Antifa, are very much cut from the same cloth as Antifa. I don't want to oversell this point because I don't know how much influence this training has over cops, since it must directly contradict their lived experience on the streets. But still, someone in our government, in the cops' chain of command, thinks having cops trained by anti-white Jewish supremacist hate groups in far-left ideology is a good idea. So not only are cops effectively acting to license and protect Antifa and Black Lives Matter rioting and looting, they're actually trained by organizations like Antifa, in ideologies like Antifa's, and they explicitly profess the pernicious values and false narratives of Black Lives Matter every time they take a knee, as they have done in several cities. You know, unless and until something changes, it's not unreasonable to regard cops as practically auxiliaries of Antifa and Black Lives Matter. And now the National Guard too, apparently. When cops and soldiers provide surplus order where it isn't needed, that's at the very least a misallocation of resources that could be better spent providing order where it is needed. And it indirectly spreads aids the spread of chaos. But when cops and soldiers actively defend the forces of chaos from peaceful, orderly citizens defending themselves and their property, you know, they're fighting directly for chaos and against order. And when cops and soldiers affirm the false doctrines and narratives of chaos in a bid to appease the forces of chaos rather than confronting them and imposing order, you know, they're making themselves allies and minions of chaos and enemies of order. You know, I think it has to be emphasized again how totally fake the narratives for all this violence pushed by the fake news, the enemy of the people, really are. You know, just how false the narratives affirmed by traitor politicians really are. Just how false the narratives endorsed by cowardly cops and soldiers really are. You know, there's no evidence that what happened between Derek Chauvin and George Floyd had anything to do with race. But people call it racist anyway with no evidence. You know, there's no epidemic, none that you can find in the statistics, of racist white cops systematically killing unarmed black men. You know, not just because they're black. Ryan Faulk, the alternative hypothesis, has a great video about the facts on this where he discusses the research. You know, I'm going to put the link in the description. That false narrative is built entirely on a half a dozen or a dozen high-profile cases, where in some of them the officers aren't even white, and in others there's pretty clear and compelling rationale for the violence employed. Folks, you can't build a grand narrative on a half a dozen or a dozen anecdotes over the span of a decade. Not if you want it to be true or complete, which this narrative certainly isn't. You know, cops kill about 1,000 people per year in America, and it can certainly be debated whether or not that represents an excessive use of force. It can certainly be argued that there's ultimately an unhelpful lack of accountability. But only about a quarter of those killed, 1/4, are black. More are actually white. So there does not appear to be a racial component to it. You know, blacks actually appear to be underrepresented as victims of police violence, because despite being only 14% of the population, they commit about half of all homicides and more than half of all robberies, and similarly outsized proportions of most other serious or violent crimes. And laboratory research in controlled conditions, you know, with simulated scenarios, show that cops hesitate longer before shooting a black suspect, and they're less likely to shoot in error compared to with a white suspect. Now, maybe it's possible to overstate the role of narrative in all this. Maybe riots and looting like this would happen even without a narrative. Maybe that's just how these people naturally behave. And there are plenty of videos of flash mob violence and flash mob robberies over the last decade, you know, predominantly committed by blacks, to suggest this. But false, fake news narratives certainly don't help. And there's at least one major difference of consequence between the narratives that these people come up with themselves to justify their predispositions and tendencies to justify their unseemly lusts and their covetous malice, and the false narratives that they're given by the fake news. At least the false narratives they come up with themselves are only believed by them and are transparently ridiculous to everyone else. The false fake news narratives created and propagated by the you-know-whos have a lot wider support, among whites, among leaders, among cops, and among soldiers. And consequently, they do a lot more damage, and they enable a lot more wanton, indefensible, and totally unacceptable rioting, looting, violence, and destruction. And that's why the fake news and their false narratives are so worth attacking. I saw the Wall Street Journal published an article saying the false fake news narratives are a myth. And the National Review published an article saying the false fake news narratives are fiction. But most of the fake news are still pushing the false fake news narratives unironically, as if they weren't thoroughly discredited. And they pushed them in 2014, 2015, and 2016, when those false fake news narratives triggered riots and looting then too. So they know what the results of pushing these false fake news narratives are. It certainly looks like these false fake news narratives about racist white cops supposedly systematically murdering unarmed black men just because they're black triggered riots whenever they were trotted out before. And it certainly looks like these demonstrably false fake news narratives triggered riots and looting when they were trotted out this time. And somebody decided to trot them out. So send the bill for everything destroyed, looted, stolen, smashed, burned to the fake news. Send the bill to CNN, to NBC, to NPR. Send the bill to Fox News for falling down on the job if they don't aggressively challenge these narratives. Send the bill to foreign fake news too. The CBC, the BBC, Channel 4, The Guardian. Sue them in their own countries. And if that isn't possible, revoke their press credentials and make it impossible for them to operate in ours. In U.S. law, traditionally, you can't charge someone with incitement to riot for advocating ideas and opinions independent from an explicit call to riot. But maybe this idea, these narratives, are so false and destructive, we got to be able to make an exception for them. That seems to be the grounds on which European countries ban National Socialism. That is false and destructive. Well, how false and destructive does an idea have to be? What benefit is there in allowing demonstrably false and demonstrably destructive ideas to be systematically propagated intentionally to incite violence and unrest? I think these false fake news narratives that were used to instigate these riots and this looting have got to pass the threshold to warrant suppression. Now, there have been some positive developments too. I have seen armed white citizens stepping up to defend their communities and businesses in Snohomish, in Bellevue, in Kennewick, in Dallas, in Coeur d'Alene, in Rapid City, in the suburbs of Philadelphia. That's what's needed. We need more of that. White people need to strap up, need to defend themselves, need to defend their homes, need to defend their families, need to defend their neighborhoods and communities and businesses. A sheriff in Florida encouraged citizens to shoot any looter who attempted to enter their homes. A gun store owner in Philadelphia and a bar owner in Omaha shot looters and apparently aren't being charged. Trump finally came out and made a statement, and it was a pretty good statement. He did start out by saying his administration was committed to justice for George Floyd. And as far as I'm concerned, George Floyd got his justice. Because like so many of these other so-called martyrs, he was just a no-good, two-bit serial crook and parasite with negative value. So it's good that he's gone, no matter what you think about the manner in which he departed. And there may be a valid argument about that. But other than that, the president gave a very strong statement, a very sweet statement. Just a terrific statement. Everybody agrees. Now let's see if he follows it up in any meaningful way. One conspiracy theory I've heard is that all of this was set off as a pretext to bring in martial law and gun control. Now, it was definitely set off by the fake news with their false narratives, deliberately, as I've said. That part is beyond dispute. They did it for some reason, though I don't quite know what that is. Martial law may actually be helpful as long as it's a temporary measure that aims at supplying order, not surplus order. Neither wasteful and unnecessary surplus order that doesn't protect or address the real issue, nor positively harmful surplus order that actually protects the perpetrators of rioting and looting. But I think gun control is dead in the water. I'm not too worried about that. It's always something we have to keep an eye out for, of course. But nobody is giving up their guns willingly right now, not after all this. People are buying guns like crazy, and if they aren't, they will be. Democrats are better gun salesmen out of power, it seems, than they ever were in it under Obama. Even a lot of shit libs are starting to wish they had some guns right now, when the government obviously can't protect them from their own violent pets. Finally, and I'm certainly not advocating it, in fact, I'm going to say definitely don't do this. But in the past, conservative whites have rioted too. Whites rioted, killing and expelling blacks from Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898 and Forsyth County, Georgia in 1912. Whites rioted and murdered blacks in 1917 in St. Louis. Whites rioted and killed blacks and burned black homes and businesses in 1921 in Tulsa, and at various other times and places as well. Leaders need to take care and take heed. If rioting and destruction and looting and murder and violence and mayhem are normalized and legitimized and defended instead of being suppressed and contained, I suspect it's going to be very hard for them to maintain those things as the exclusive privilege and prerogative of just one group and its supposed allies. So they need to get a handle on things, and they need to do it soon.